There has never been a full-scale scholarly critical edition of A Tale of Two Cities published. I'm delighted to be engaged in preparing one for the Oxford edition of Charles Dickens. And the most important part of that work, establishing the text, is reliant on a careful examination of the various sources for that text, textual collation. I use the monthly serial Parts as my copy text. I've carefully collated or compared 9 other texts with that one, recording all differences, whether those be of spelling, punctuation, capitalization, hyphenation, format, or wording. I've collated the monthly parts with the manuscript of the novel, with the scant surviving proofs, and with the first book edition, with the text published in America in Harper's Weekly, and with the text published in the weekly installments of All Year Round, and with the texts of the collected editions over which Dickens could have had some control, the Illustrated Library edition of 1863, an 1866 printing of that same edition, the People's edition of 1866, and the Charles Dickens edition of 1868. WPI is acquiring a copy of the cheap edition of 1864, reportedly identical to the People's. I look forward to testing that report in the coming weeks. It is my pleasure today to point to a few of the interesting things and, to be fair, a few of the less interesting but still important things that this extensive textual collation reveals. Exhaustive textual collation of every variant, including the adding or deleting of a comma, the spelling of a word like honor, the capitalization and hyphenation of Fleet Street, and the hyphenation or lack thereof in words like upstairs, is repetitive work, and the benefits are not always readily apparent as one painstakingly documents the precise location of all such minute differences. In many cases, the value comes from the ability to aggregate and analyze data meaningfully. Only after careful and complete collation can one say authoritatively that there are only 204 variants between the monthly serial parts and the original weekly serial installments in All the Year Round, or that most of the nearly 3,600 variants in Harper's Weekly pertain to punctuation, not spelling, or that the Illustrated Library edition is twice as likely to delete a comma as it is to add one. The most rewarding part of textual collation is work with Dickens's manuscripts, which are almost endlessly fascinating. What we can learn from words, phrases, and passages Dickens crossed out in his manuscript, and what we can learn from things Dickens wrote in between the lines, cannot be listed easily or exhaustively and will not be included in the Oxford edition, apart from some salient examples that I will include in the essay on the text. But even setting these categories aside, there are a total of 5,781 variants between the manuscript and the monthly parts. About a third of those represent commas present in the monthly parts that are lacking in the manuscript. There are, of course, many other sorts of variants in punctuation. There are also many variants in spelling, capitalization, compounding, and the like. Only about 18% represent changes in wording, most often affecting only a word or two, but at times offering substantial phrases, sentences, and on rare occasions, paragraphs. More on that later. All 1,225 changes in wording between the manuscript and the monthly parts will appear in the Oxford textual apparatus in the historical collation. There are some wonderful things, including passages Dickens wrote and left standing in manuscript that did not appear in print, presumably cut in proof no longer extant. Here are 2 examples. First, a description of Dr. Manette. He was a very quiet man, studied much, slept little, generally had great self-command, and loved his daughter with inexpressible tenderness. And then here's a narratorial comment about aristocratic Parisian women. Strange under such refining circumstances that the fine ladies should have become cruel, but it was often remarked that they had recently been by far the most eager spectators of a most horrible execution. Textual collation of the American journal, Harper's Weekly, reveals more variants than in any other printed edition, at least partly because of American spellings, some of which match Dickens's own spellings in manuscript. Most of the variants, over 2,200 of them, are punctuational. But Harper's Weekly also prints some passages that have never appeared in Britain. The proofs Dickens sent to America were early ones, sometimes containing passages Dickens must have cut in later proofs before the publication of either the monthly serial parts or the weekly installments of All the Year Round. Again, 2 examples will suffice today. First, 2 very brief paragraphs of dialogue, never printed in England. "Now then," said Mr. Cruncher. "Now then, father," remonstrated his staggering son. Here's another unique passage, never printed in England, for which "the stately residence of Monsignor was altogether blighted and deserted," was later substituted. "House, the law smites you," had been officially said to the stately residence of Monsignor, and under the little hammer that had struck it in that name, it had opened and begun to fall asunder. The costly fittings were all removed, the windows were gone, and the great staircase was being packed up in piecemeal. Unique among all of Dickens's novels, A Tale of Two Cities was published virtually simultaneously in 2 completely different typesettings, the monthly parts and the weekly installments published in double columns in Dickens's journal All Year Round. Which one is first? On which text did Dickens lavish his closest attention? My most significant finding, the most important thing an exhaustive textual collation has revealed, is that there are surprisingly few changes of any sort between the 2 typesettings, fewer than 1 per page. Because of the importance of All the Year Round in the textual history of the novel, Oxford will print all 204 variants, so a reader can construct that text in every detail from the textual apparatus. Only 35 verbal variants in All the Year Round are neither obvious errors nor the correction of obvious errors. Several are the change between Citizen Defarge and Defarge, and between Monsieur the Marquis or the Marquis for Monsignor, twice in chapter titles. There are only 12 textual variants between the monthly parts and the first bound book edition. 6 are the result of missing punctuation from damaged type. The most celebrated change is fixing an erroneous page number. The page following 212 appears in the parts as 113, corrected to 213 in later states of the bound book edition. It is unclear to what extent Dickens was responsible for any changes in the later collected editions. There are some corrections, there are some new errors, but neither category is necessarily the result of Dickens's personal intervention. Substantially interesting verbal variants, really significant changes of wording in the later collected editions are rare. Perhaps 2 or 3 of the most significant will show how comparatively insignificant these changes are. A close textual collation, of course, is necessary to reveal that there are no important changes. You never know what you will find until you look. There are 143 variants between the Illustrated Library edition of 1863 and the original monthly installments. Only 44 of those variants pertain to wording. The 3 most significant are not, I think, very significant. Quartier Latin appears as student quarter of Paris. Stryver's statement that it would be a good thing for others appears as a bad thing for me. And the prepositional phrase of the Royal Guard appears as in the Palace Courtyard. Only 1,000 copies of the Illustrated Library edition were printed, but there was apparently a continuing demand, perhaps primarily from overseas, for copies of this edition, and 750 more copies were printed in 1866. One might guess that the 1866 printing would be identical to the one from 1863, and one wouldn't be far wrong. Nevertheless, there are 87 textual variants between the 1863 edition and the 1866 printing. Several variants represent the correction of errors in 1863, but almost 3 times as often 1866 offers new errors. The 1866 printing provides a single intriguing instance of a substantial deletion. An entire sentence disappears. Here is the omitted sentence, discussing the executioner who operates the guillotine in Paris. The name of the strong man of old scripture had descended to the chief functionary who worked it. But so armed, he was stronger than his namesake and blinder, and tore away the gates of God's own temple every day. Subsequently, the name Samson appears as Sanson 3 times, once in each of 3 different chapters. This oddity may look like authorial revision. After all, the executioner was, in fact, named Sanson. But Dickens and his most important historical source, Thomas Carlyle, both chose to play off the name of the Old Testament strongman Samson, and the corrections of Samson to Sanson are to be understood, I think, as literal-minded and ultimately misguided interventions. The verbal change introduced in the People's edition of 1866 that is most likely to be intentional is the addition of the word military twice to modify drums in the Palace Courtyard, and then again drums a few lines later. The word military was dropped in both places from the later Charles Dickens edition. Significant verbal changes introduced for the first time in the Charles Dickens edition are even fewer than the handful in the People's. The most significant might be the substitution of whole for old. The mender of roads, telling an oft-repeated story, went through the old performance in every previous version of the text, but went through the whole performance in the Charles Dickens edition. This change looks likely to be a compositor's error. The Charles Dickens edition adds 107 descriptive running heads, probably composed by Dickens, at the top of most of the odd-numbered pages. These should be understood as paratextual, and though I will include all of these in the apparatus, they are not part of the text proper. Let me conclude with 2 final examples of surprising things textual collation can reveal. The word hillside appeared as hill hyphen line end side in the monthly serial parts, an ambiguous hyphen at line end, which a textual editor must resolve as either hard or soft. Should readers understand this word as a hyphenated compound or as a single 8-letter word with no hyphen? Would you hyphenate hillside or not? I would not. So I initially resolved this one as soft. But here's what textual collation reveals. Not only did Dickens hyphenate the word in manuscript, but it is hyphenated in America, Harper's Weekly, all the year round, and in each of the 4 later collected editions. Pretty strong evidence that Dickens might have wanted that hyphen after all. Finally, the phrase last king appears thus in the monthly parts, the manuscript, Harper's Weekly, all the year round, and the illustrated library edition, but the People's edition introduces an obvious typo. Instead of last king, the nonsense laet king appears, the E inadvertently replacing the S. The Charles Dickens edition gives the unique reading late king. If an editor looked at any or all early editions but didn't see the weird error in the People's text, one might have guessed that the reading late king was a choice of Dickens's, an intentional revision, perhaps revealing something important. But careful textual collation, even of a text with as little evidence of authorial revision as the People's, reveals the strong likelihood that a printer setting type from the People's edition took it upon himself to make sense of late and sensibly guessed at late. The work of textual collation is tedious, repetitive, and painstaking. It is also exciting. One never knows what one might find. The most fun is work with the manuscript, but surprising and valuable discoveries can and do appear anywhere. Thank you very much.